Jones, Richmond's law librarian.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. For coming out tonight. Can you hear me okay? Thank you all for coming tonight. These little things, they really get to you. Thanks. Yeah. Wardrobe malfunction. Welcome to the Richmond Public Library for the discussion of what makes a fact true, local journalism and American democracy. I'm Melvin Jenkins Jones, and I'm the law librarian for the Richmond Public Law Library, which is housed here in the Richmond Public Library. I would like to recognize the Richmond Public Library members of the Richmond Public Library Board, the members of the Richmond Public Library Foundation, and the members of the Friends of the Richmond Public Library. Thank you all for coming. Also, I'd like to recognize Ben Himmelfarb, who is my direct supervisor. He's the acting community services manager of the main library, and he's the one that gave me the microphone. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Good, good. We are especially happy to welcome the panelists for this evening's discussion, who are journalist Michael Paul Williams, winner of the Pulitzer Prize for his commentary on the Richmond monuments; Chip Jones, Pulitzer-nominated journalist and author of the Virginia Commonwealth University's 2022 common book, The Organ Thieves, the shocking story of the first heart transplant in the segregated South; and Stephanie M. Rizzi, assistant professor in the Virginia Commonwealth University Department of Focused Inquiry, and currently serving on the Richmond City School Board as the 5th District Representative. Ms. Rizzi will be moderating the discussion between Mr. Williams and Mr. Jones. Ms. Rizzi is graciously standing in for Dr. Mallory Perryman, who is unable to moderate this evening. The Richmond Public Law Library is the proud recipient of a Democracy and the Informed Citizen grant from the Virginia Center for the Book. This program was developed by yours truly with funding support from the Virginia Center for the Book, a program of Virginia Humanities, as a part of its Democracy and the Informed Citizen initiative. The Andrew W. Mellon Foundation provided generous support for this initiative in partnership with the Pulitzer Prizes. Therefore, we thank the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the Virginia Center for the Book for their generous support of this initiative, and the Pulitzer Prizes for their partnership. This program is part of the Democracy and the Informed Citizen initiative administered across the nation by the Federation of State Humanities Councils, and the initiative seeks to deepen the public's knowledge and appreciation of the vital connections between democracy, the humanities, journalism, and an informed citizenry. Now I would like to introduce to you our moderator, Stephanie M. Rizzi. She will introduce Mr. Williams and Mr. Jones. Stephanie M. Rizzi is an assistant professor in the VCU Department of Focused Inquiry, and she is the Richmond City School Board 5th District Representative. Ms. Rizzi wrote the teaching framework for the VCU resource guide on teaching Chip Jones' book, The Organ Thieves. A lifelong resident of Richmond City and Caroline County, Virginia, Ms. Rizzi is a graduate of VCU with a BS in Mass communications, news editorial, and a master's in English. Ms. Rizzi was a K-12 teacher for 10 years where she taught English and journalism. As a newspaper sponsor at Hermitage High School for 3 years, Ms. Rizzi prepared many young people for careers in the media and communications fields. Ms. Rizzi will now introduce Mr. Williams and Mr. Jones. Stephanie?
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? No.
Hello? Okay.
Yeah, it's kind of spotty. No. It's like it's kind of on and off. Hello? Yeah. Okay, now, all right. It seems to be okay now. And thank you. All right, so yes, my name is Stephanie Miller-Rizzi. I am sorry if you were expecting Dr. Perryman. I am pinch hitting tonight and I will do my best. I would like to introduce to you our two panelists. First, we have Chip Jones. Chip Jones has been reporting for nearly 30 years for the Richmond Times-Dispatch, the Roanoke Times, Virginia Business Magazine, and other publications. As a reporter for the Roanoke Times, he was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize for his work on the pits and coal strike. He is the former communications director of the Richmond Academy of Medicine, which is where he first discovered the heart-stopping story in the Organ Thieves. The Organ Thieves is currently, it was chosen as the common book for Virginia Commonwealth University, which means that every freshman will work with this book in their focused inquiry classes and in other classes. And it will be discussed throughout the entire university. Organ Thieves also won the Library of Virginia 2021 literary prize in nonfiction. And so everyone, please welcome Mr. Chip Jones. Okay, tonight we're also blessed to have Mr. Michael Paul Williams, who is a native of Richmond. In 1992, he became the first Black columnist at his hometown paper, an outlet in the former capital of the Confederacy that once enforced massive resistance. Williams is a graduate of Hermitage High School, Virginia Union University, and Northwestern University. His unflinching truth-telling has secured numerous honors, among them a Neiman Fellowship and the title of reporter who makes you want to tear up the newspaper from a local magazine.
Tear up, tear up.
Yes. He's equally proud of each. He is the 2021 Pulitzer Prize winner in commentary, which he won for his penetrating and historically insightful comments that guided Richmond, a former capital of the Confederacy, through the painful and complicated process of dismantling the city's monuments to white supremacy. So everyone, we're pleased to welcome Mr. Michael Paul Williams. So we are imagining this evening will be a conversation style panel discussion. It will be quite informal. We are asking Mr. Jones and Mr. Williams just to relax and have a conversation. And I will use questions to prompt that. And so with that, we will start with the first question.
Feel free to join in.
I will if it becomes appropriate, I will join it. All right, so the first question is, what does it mean to be an informed citizen? And is this something that is important?
Can you hear me?
No.
The mics are coming in and out, so I don't know what to say. I'll talk loud.
There you go.
So to that, I would say,
Absolutely.
and I would say that your presence here tonight is proof of that.
I think that
I said to Michael as he came in, because I first worked with him in '92. I got to join the TV after '93.
after Virginia Business.
And
So after joining the paper, I've been really amazed by Michael's career progress. And I'm gonna just say real quickly two things as introduction to my long-winded answer. What a 1 degree of separation town Richmond is, or city, whatever we are, because all three of us have connection to Hermitage High School, student, teacher, and me as a failed English teacher in 2010. The other is, and I know that this is being live streamed, am I right? Yes. So I think there's some student journalists and maybe some in the audience. So good to see some younger members of the future journalism fraternity and sorority. And so as a fact-checking thing, I thought I would mention the fact, I'm not claiming to be an oracle, but this, you can fact-check this live, because a lot of people, anyone under 40 can do this in 5 seconds, like my kids. 1 year before the Pulitzer Prize was awarded, I actually advocated and semi-predicted that Michael would win the Pulitzer Prize. And I was so happy when it happened, and he was such a nice guy that he actually returned my tweet. So thank you for that. You know, as the older you get, to get your tweets returned is a good thing. But I just think that the informed citizenry question is connects us all. And I'm a writer now, not a daily journalist. So I'm like you guys, I'm sure, in trying to ferret out the truth, the facts. If we don't have information, many people said it, and Michael has written it many times. I think that we're pretty much, I don't want to use the word doomed, but certainly troubled as a democracy. And when I was thinking about that question, especially for student journalists, to me, facts are like road signs on a highway, and we're all going on in our lives, whatever it is we're trying to figure out. You know, investments, healthcare, elections, certainly elections. And if we don't have road signs to guide us in ways that we all can read and agree upon, maybe the rules of the road for those road signs, to me, that's the facts. That's what we're here to talk about. And I think that we can all agree in the past 6 or 7 years, wherever you want to draw that line, the line between facts and deception has gotten to the point where we've gone on some off ramps. That's the metaphor I would use to describe the importance of an informed citizen. How do you, Mike?
Well,
Yep, I'm gonna give you this microphone.
Hello? There you go. Needs a temperament. I don't typically need a mic. I think the conundrum here is, okay, we're talking about how essential it is to have an informed citizenry. And I think the dilemma we face is that we have such a misinformed citizenry. I'm thinking back, and I don't want to sound like a Luddite or someone who resents technology, but I can just recall when growing up, we got 2 daily newspapers here in Richmond, in addition to the Times-Dispatch and the News Leader, in addition to getting the Richmond Afro-American newspaper. And we watched 4 networks: NBC, ABC, CBS, and public television. And it wasn't perfect, but there was something about that, the limitations of the information, that made it more manageable. And you kind of had a sense when you were watching Walter Cronkite that you were getting the real deal. And I think our issue now is we have so many sources of information, and we have given people the option of tuning out what's really legit information. And I mean, the result, I mean, we have something like we have in Buffalo, where someone can go online and just access a bunch of nonsense that's repeated ad nauseum on America's favorite talk news show,
and his host, Tucker Carlson. And we get a result that's violent, murderous, and inherently undemocratic. So I think when, who was it that said alternate facts? It was one of Donald Trump's minions. I mean, I think that just kind of, yeah, I mean, that just kind of ushered it. The moment we heard that phrase, oh, this is not good. This is Orwell come to life. And this is what where our challenge is. I mean, people can get their information. The citizens can get their information. They're just choosing not to. And I don't know how we conquer that dilemma. The self-selection is taking place. It's leading people down not just a wrong path, but just an insane path where they believe things that make no sense at all. And with results that literally threaten to topple democracy.
Thank you. And based on the way this conversation goes, can you hear me even if I don't have the mic or no? I will select questions in that order. And so what you are talking about will lead me to this question. How does one become media literate in this wild west of quote unquote information?
Well, I'm not in the schoolhouse. I mean, I only know what I've read, and what I've read suggests that civics, for instance, is not emphasized the way it once was. So, you're an educator. Tell me if that's not correct, but my sense is, based on what I've gleaned, that we're not teaching our children at a very young age how to be citizens, how to access information, how to distinguish what's real and what's factual from what's false, how to petition their government, just basics about our political system. It seems like somewhere along the way that kind of fell by the wayside. It became, it was deemed less important. And if we're not, I mean, again, I hate to keep coming back to Buffalo. That's an 18-year-old man. I mean, how did so many things go wrong in 18 years? How can one accumulate that much ignorance in 18 years? There are just so many failures there. So I'd say it needs to start early. I think a major problem is that people who should know better are so-called leaders, people in high political office, people who've been given the privilege to have a nationwide audience on radio or a national audience on television, are espousing highly undemocratic views, are for how many decades now preaching the gospel of disrespect for legitimate news media, which isn't perfect, of course, but part of the reason that newspapers and so-called mainstream media are having their issues other than technology is that there's been a concerted campaign, at least going on for 4 decades, to discredit it by people who should know better. And when you start discrediting, I mean, it's called the fourth estate, the press. If you start discrediting the fourth estate, what about the other three? I mean, where does that leave our respect for Congress, our respect for the judiciary, our respect for the executive branch? So it's like we're almost intent on a kind of self-destruction of democracy by kind of chiseling away at its regard.
So I would just tag on to that by saying, yelling into my microphone again. Thank you. I'll try this one. I would just tag on to that, as an older person
who's kind of grown up in the age of the internet. First of all, remember it was, the words of Henry Adams, this whole thing is a law of unintended consequences. The internet was supposed to be a force for good. It was supposed to help, started out with science and researchers sharing studies around the world. Of course, a little known fact is, I think it started in the Pentagon in the DARPA program, but it was used for good for a while. And I think that jumping forward to where we are now, and with young folks who use, let's say, Snapchat, there's an interesting article in the Washington Post recently about a California young lady who was being stalked by a Marine out there. And finally, in terms of accountability, what you're saying, Michael, the family filed a class action suit recently. It's an interesting article in the Washington Post within it last week, but I'm sure you can find it. But we got to start holding the makers of this, accountable. There's an old saying about, in terms of, and this comes from the church side of things, but you got to get people out, pull them out of the river, but then look who threw them in upstream. I think when you think about Facebook, the creators, the Silicon Valley executives who created Facebook, Instagram, all the other applications, one of the most interesting stories I read at some point was how none of the executives let their kids have devices. Why was that? Exactly what Michael's saying. The clicks on Facebook and all of the different applications are all tied to really highly developed psychological principles. And the main one is the one that gets your deep part of your brain. Some of your scientists in here will remember the name of it. Hypothalamus. Thank you. I'm glad there's some medical people. I'm not. I'm just a reporter. But really, it's fearfully true, and it's a lot like what George Orwell predicted. And if you're a student in the audience and you haven't read 1984, which was written in the late 40s, it's amazingly prophetic about Twitter, because he predicted this thing called doublespeak, which was all based on basically eviscerating the language and dumbing it down and making it like a series of stimuli. Well, really, that's what all these devices are used for, and that's why. So, in terms of being informed, how do you figure things out? You got to go first of all into what you're carrying, what your kids are carrying, what you're carrying in your pocket, and what do you do with it? What is the intent of that? On a broader scale, I always say, and especially with medical stories, and I've been blessed to work with a lot of physicians on my book. When you're looking for look for neutrality. Boy, there's a word we don't hear much anymore, right? Look for people, ask yourself what the motive is of any website or any message. Like Michael said, most of the motives, the easiest political or whatever, advertising, the motive is obviously to sell or get people fired up. How do you do that? You go into what is it? The hypothalamus. It's PER, right? And hypothalamus, get it fired up. Well, how is that? How does that happen? Well, if you look at the recent New York Times analysis, frankly, of Tucker Carlson's stuff about something I never heard of, I'm sure you might have heard of it before, the white replacement garbage from the ultra-right. What could be prodding your brain more and make you more angry than that? And that's what motivated that kid, sadly, in Buffalo. So I think it's a mix of, for us, it's like being a consumer. So like if you want to get medical information, go to some place that's neutral. And I would say, where is that? The Mayo Clinic side. If you want to know about an operation, or Cleveland Clinic, you can go to the AMA, you can go to Journal of American Medical Association, but look for places like that. And sure, every place has a certain maybe slant or something. And we haven't talked a long time about the word objectivity. And I've always said, and this argument has gone back a long time when the media started it be vilified in the 90s. It's an easy technique, kill the messenger. I always say, look, we all have our own implicit biases, as they say in medicine. That's what my book is about. It's about the implicit biases of the white surgeons in the late 60s. That's what they're working on now. That's why that's part of the reason it's a common book, maybe at least on the medical campus. We all have biases and you have to understand them. But to me, objectivity is when you see an article that has as many points of view presented by that particular writer, that's good. And it lets you decide. That's the decision I made with my book. That's why it has 1 million endnotes. Because if you think I'm full of it, which I might be sitting right here, I don't think my book is, because it lets you, the reader, decide. And so much, and I'll turn it over to you guys, so much of it seems like people are just being led around by their hypothalamus.
Okay.
Yeah, just to Chip's point, relative to the hypothalamus. I mean, I'm a movie buff, so I don't know how many of you have seen Terminator. And there are other movies like it where technology, the menaces of technology are presented as, say, artificial intelligence turning on us in the form of robots or whatever, turning on us and wiping us out. And I mean, why would they need to? I mean, you invent something that can stimulate our hypothalamus or whatever. It's like a drug. We talk about the war on drugs. It's and how unproductive that's been for how long now. But we have a war on drugs where we're targeting all sorts of substances. But this sounds like it's functioning exactly like a drug, and it's creating an addiction. And I'll buy a conspiracy theory. I mean, that's not unintentional. I think the people who invented it knew exactly what effect it would have. But yeah, we need to talk more about internet usage as an addiction, with all the problems that are inherent thereof.
Thank you. So this kind of leads to, because I know, you mentioned not wanting to look like a Luddite. There are many young people who would take exception to a lot of what you just said, right? There are a lot of people who—
They're young.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, there are some who legitimately believe that social media has a positive role to play in the dissemination of news and information. And so I'm wondering if either of you could talk about the potential of the internet and social media in terms of maybe accessibility, maybe equity in access. And are there ways that the internet could play a positive role if one is responsible in how they consume it and use it? Because I just know, as a person who teaches research, that it's not all bad news.
I'm being unserious when I joke about. I mean, my wife is always like on me about how much I'm staring at this thing. The internet has the potential to be enormously productive in nurturing democracy. I mean, I always say, can you imagine if Martin Luther King and all the activists of the 50s and 60s had one of these? And I mean, just think of how they mobilized people without that. Just think what they could have done. And what we saw in 2020 is an example of that. Just the tremendous power of mobilization. But it does come with its inherent inequities. I mean, these things aren't cheap, for one. So there are people who don't have access to the technology that could probably benefit from it the most. The problem, I think the problem is it's a double-edged sword. That we have actors who are trying to use this for good, and we have other folks who are trying to use it for ill and succeeding. So I'm not anti-technology, but I think like so many aspects of technology, I think we rolled this baby out and we didn't really think about the consequences. Newspapers saw technology back in the 1990s and said, oh, great, we'll just offer our newspaper for free. And I mean, yeah, at the time, no one saw, I mean, it was a disastrous decision. But at the time, people weren't questioning it. All the newspapers did it because they just couldn't see how the technology would become so all-encompassing.
You know, tagging on what you said about Martin Luther King, Michael, it struck me as really interesting because when you think about the George Floyd murder, I was thinking how in Selma and other civil rights demonstrations, what little I know about the history of Martin Luther King, which is probably not enough, but what I do know is that he made conscious decisions to have the media of the day there for the events in order to basically shake the apathy of white Northerners such as myself and others, and to see firsthand what was going on. And I was just thinking how, and what you said rightly so is it's a double-edged sword, Stephanie, with and you know, when you're older, it's going to be like, okay, boomer. So you know, I get that, but I think reporting and the good media I see, one thing is steeped in using digital stuff. Like when the Al Jazeera reporter was recently shot in the West Bank, and the Israeli Defense Force said it was all a crossfire, and then I'm always amazed. I'm a real news hound, as I call my wife, who's a teacher, a retired teacher. She says, "What do you mean I'm a news hound? You're the news hound." I am. And when I saw how well the Post covered that from Jerusalem, I think it was, or on the West Bank, I should say, they used GPS positioning to show where the troops were right away. So I think the difference is you can do immediate fact checking, but the flip side of it is you can do immediate distortion. And I think, if I'm hearing you right, Michael, and the other side of this is, because we haven't talked about local news so much, if there's no one there at the planning commission meeting, like I used to cover in Blacksburg or Christiansburg, where I was the only person not elected to stay till 11 o'clock at night, I guarantee you, I'm willing to predict. I noticed our former publisher sitting in the back, who I won't name, that you can check your devices if you're under 40 and figure out who it is. But I predict for sure, it's happening right now, so much local corruption. I mean, we think we know that we're holding our, senators or congressmen to feet to the fire. There are so many deals, housing, real estate, environmental, just so much corruption because no one's there. And so that's circling back to the initial idea behind this panel is like, what's a journalist? A journalist, I was thinking about this, an easy metaphor. The journalist is the person who's sitting there with the ear against the closed door with a notebook or now an iPhone in their hand. And it happened to me once when the aforesaid publisher who's here was at the paper, and somebody complained on the Capital Resource. If you ever go into the Richmond Airport, there's this huge sign, the Capital Area Airport Commission. It's all for, if you live in the area, you have a representative there. Most people don't know it. And somebody complained to my editor and said, well, Chip had his ear to the door and then he was talking to one of the members and he wasn't nice. And that's the job of a journalist. Be the eyes and ears of the public. But if the eyes and ears aren't there, what's going on? End of speech. Sorry. Soapbox.
Yeah, it's gonna be like what was Joni Mitchell's song, Yellow Taxi. You don't know what you've got till it's gone. When you lose your local newspapers, I mean, it's been tied to all sorts of negative outcomes. We don't want to get to that point. A lot of national news starts off as local news. I don't think it's any accident that the perilous state in which our democracy sits has coincided with the erosion of the power and the population of daily newspapers. It's not a coincidence. And I don't think we want to get to the point where we're trying to, where we're lamenting what happened to our local newspaper, because it will not be good for the city or any city.
Okay, thank you both. I think that's going to lead to two questions that I think I'd like to put together. The first one would be, because we are now talking about local media, what impacts the reliability and trustworthiness of local media? We're talking about present day local media. And then how does the concentration of media ownership and corporate influence impact local media with the news that we consume daily on the local level? For example, Lee Enterprises, which now owns the Times-Dispatch, 77 dailies and 350 weekly classified and specialty publications. So what effect does the centralization of ownership have on our local media and its reliability and trustworthiness?
I think most journalists I know, I think just about any journalist, if they're honest, would prefer local ownership of media. I think it's healthier. The newspaper owner who's in Richmond knows Richmond and what Richmond prioritizes and what Richmond wants and what Richmond needs, more so than the owner who is halfway across the country, who has dozens of other properties to tend to. Having said that, we were essentially locally owned at one point, and it was far from perfect. Those were the days of massive resistance. So I would welcome, I don't care where the ownership is located, as long as the ownership cares about what's happening in my town and is running or is letting our newspaper run, or any newspaper run, accordingly. The dilemma we face as newspapers is that there are too few owners, and then these chains get targeted by, say, a hedge fund, by Alden, and then there are all these ripple effects to that, and it becomes newspaper by Wall Street. And what drives the stock up certainly is not always best for the worker, for the citizen, for democracy. So that's the dilemma we're in. But I do think the farther decisions get away from the people they affect, the less positive it is.
There's not a whole lot I can add to that except the idea of competition. It's human nature to want to compete, and if you've got someone else breathing down your neck to get a story, it often leads to good results. I started out so at the bottom of the news business at the now defunct Blacksburg Sun, and my big rival was the Roanoke Times, and I loved scooping them because they didn't stay to the end of the meeting. Well, why should they? They'd already filed their story. And a lot of times I would write about things, I'm sure, some sewer line going out into Montgomery County or by Virginia Tech. But sometimes I probably hit on, pretty, just hit or miss, I think the lack of competition, I think the lack of, there are other sort of spin-offs. I was thinking when Michael was reflecting on that, the lack of local ownership has huge ramifications for all the nonprofits in the area, all the support of the various, organizations. So it's a societal impact, but I don't know if the first part of your question, Stephanie, can you kind of dig down into that a little bit more? Because I'm interested in what you were thinking about. I'm not sure I got that.
the first part of it was what impacts the reliability and trustworthiness of local media.
The impact on the reliability, trust,
Right,
okay.
and trustworthiness. And, I
Yeah.
have noticed, especially in Richmond, that a lot of our publications and media outlets are ad driven or driven by something other than,
Right.
what the objective truth might be,
Right.
or at least the reporting seems to reflect that.
I got you. So in the past, there was I think, kind of a balance between being able to separate the ads from the, they used to talk about church and state, the news, and the news being the church and the editorial being the state, and the advertising side was kind of, I don't know, hell no. But I noticed this in the 90s. A trend started where newspapers and magazines, when I was at Virginia Business, started this thing called the advertorial. Now, even the Washington Post has some advertorials, and there's a lot of interesting fraught stuff there. They have a weekly one from China and from Russia. I don't know if that's still running, but this notion of advertorials is, that showed that newspapers 30 years ago or magazines were already seeing, a decline. What was the decline from? It was from TV. It had been years, 20, 30 years since the heyday of very large papers. And the last thing I'll say about that is, if you really want to test my thesis, go to the library, Virginia, or over here. I'm sure that library here can help you get on the Times-Dispatch from the 50s and 60s, which I used a lot of those clips in the Organ Thieves. It is friggin' amazing how many ads and how interesting they are. So those are free for $5. I know you can get, probably here, you can get a subscription. Is it $5 or
It's free.
Free here. So even though the microphones don't work that great, free subscriptions. But it is really interesting. You can dig down into history right off your home computer. The other thing I would say about the question of trust, I've had some really interesting discussions, especially with Black readers. In fact, one here with Sean Rizzi of VCU about a month ago here. And one of the things I learned a lot writing The Organ Thieves as a white former journalist and about Richmond, because I'm from the DC area, so I've always been considered sort of an outsider, not myself, but if someone stops me and asks me for directions, they say, "You're not from around here, are you?" I go, "No, ma'am, I'm the son of a U.S. Marine. I was all over the country." But when I read when I read the accounts from the Times-Dispatch and the News Leader, and from the Richmond Afro-American of the same event, the taking of a Black man's heart for a heart transplant, the language is so different. And the Times-Dispatch would call it, historic operation. It was the first heart transplant in Virginia, but the Afro would call it heart snatch. And that was true of other. And so I started keying more into the language a little bit and realizing how ignorant I was of that. And so I would say, in terms of media literacy too, for students, but adults alike, reporters and readers, you have to be almost like CIA or intelligence officers. Decode the language. See how loaded it is. You write about all the time, Michael. I mean, it's amazing stuff. Can you reflect on that?
Well, to the point of trust, when I came into the business 40 years ago and went out on the streets of Richmond and told people where I worked, I was immediately told, corrected into saying that I worked for the Times-Discreet. And yeah, I wish I had $1 every time I was told I worked for Richmond Times-Disgrace. And it was just the reporting that Chip just mentioned and the disparities and the different, basically literally two different versions of the same story that we saw in Richmond. That sort of distrust. And So, we talk a lot about diversity, and diversity has kind of gotten this, it's become like this bogeyman, really. It's become this thing that people kind of scoff at. But, the example Chip gave, it gives voice to the reason, the rationale why the industry had to diversify. Because you had all white newsrooms, literally all white newsrooms, trying to tell stories that they frankly were not equipped to tell, or were willingly ignoring, or worse. And so, yeah, we're talking about historic distrust, where you're starting behind a kind of 8-ball and you have a lot of ground to make up. Nowadays, there's distrust that has nothing to do necessarily with that legacy. It's just a perception that I gather that we're not getting it right. To the money piece of it that Chip spoke of, when I came into the newsroom, so many decades ago, money was never discussed. We were totally isolated from any financial implications involved in the newspaper, which I guess is an easy thing to do back in the 1980s, when owning a newspaper was a license to print money. But when times got tighter, it seemed like the tighter things got, the more we heard about the financial piece, and we weren't so much insulated anymore. And nowadays, it's that wall's been knocked down. When we talk about analytics, and we talk about gaining web audience, and there are financial implications in everything we do now. Where before we were kind of like on a ivory tower, unfettered by financial considerations and the taint of money, even though every time I went on the street, people told me I was trying to sell newspapers. But it's just different now. I mean, the Wu-Tang say, cash rules everything around me. I mean, it's just, that's where we are. It's nationally, in just about every way. It's all about the dollar. And that does not always serve democracy. It often does not serve democracy, those financial considerations.
That was a powerful response. I think, to be honest, Mr. Williams and I have bumped heads a couple of times recently, and I think I want to ask this question next. I mean it to be open-ended, and I'm looking for you to wax a little philosophical on it, if possible. What is truth? And is there such a thing as absolute or objective truth?
Well, I think that's from the Bible somewhere. Yeah. I think we're talking truth or facts. Truth. Yeah, I think truth can be very malleable, and I mean, Chip spoke earlier about our implicit biases. Truth often is in the eyes of the beholder. I think we each have our own truth. We don't get to invent our own facts. I think, what's true often depends on the perspective of the person whose axe is being gored, or the person who is doing the goring. I think we don't always trade in black and white in what we do as journalists. There's often a lot of gray in there. And I think the gray is where people can agree to disagree, or maybe disagree to disagree about what's verifiably true. But yeah, a lot of the stories that we deal in are layered and nuanced, can lead to the perception of bias, which is not to say
that the damn election was stolen. That's just nonsense. I mean, yeah, there's some things we just have to differentiate, that that's a lie. That's true. While also being willing to accept that we get some things wrong. And that affects our credibility, but we're not machines. Yeah, I mean, newspapers get things wrong all the time. I think, unlike a lot of institutions, when we get it wrong, there's a page where we write a correction. And there are a lot of institutions that don't do that. I'd say the majority of institutions don't do that. So I think from an accountability standpoint, newspapers hold up pretty well compared to other institutions that commit all sorts of wrong and even atrocities and never are truly held accountable or acknowledge them. I don't know if that gets at what you were talking about at all.
So this notion of being held accountable, I think is, I don't have a great philosophical answer to that. I think truth is more of a journey or a goal than it is an absolute. I think that admitting our own, just humility, just engaging in news gathering in a humble and honest way. And when Michael said that about corrections, it reminded me of in 1998 in Washington, when all the attorney generals from around the country were getting together, and they'd come up with a multi-billion-dollar settlement with Philip Morris, which in its wisdom, the Times-Dispatch had me cover nothing but news of Philip Morris for 5 years. Tobacco. And so you want to deal with a lot of smoke and mirrors. In fact, Joe Gatens, our former late great Lou Grant-like city editor, came up with a heading, "Smoke Under Fire," which I always love. It's kind of like smoke on the water. But I did everything I could to get all sides of the story in terms of smoking and health, addiction, etc. So at that moment when the tobacco industry, meaning Philip Morris, R.J. Reynolds, Lorillard, mostly, were ready to sign an agreement where they gave, I forget what it was really, but 10 billion maybe, I don't know what it was. That may have been what Philip Morris sued ABC for 5 years before that. But I was standing there and I was listening to, it's really fun when you're a local reporter covering one of these big stories. And I was standing there I met the Washington Post reporter, whoever it was. So big news organizations. And somebody, I think they were from London, I'm not sure, but he was doing a live broadcast and he was saying, we have the agreement and we understand X. I can't remember what he said. And there had been nothing official released. And I looked at this guy who I knew and I said, "How did he get that?" He said, "He doesn't know. He's just making that up. He's live." And I said, "Well, will they do a correction?" He said, "No, they never do corrections." So the next time you're watching something, it used to be the old saying was, "Don't believe everything you read." I would underline, "Don't believe everything you see or hear or Twitter," more than everything you read. I think at this point, reading is almost, what would you call it in the age we're living in? But sort of, I hope it's not a lost art. But when you don't see, there's no correction. There has to be some accountability, and there used to be with sharp editors that are in the room here, a lot of accountability. When you're the reporter and you come back to the newsroom, you say, "I found this." Well, how do you know this? And when I was a young reporter, I can't tell you how many times editors saved my you-know-what, because there are libel laws, and a lot of people don't realize it. Of course, there's been the great Johnny Depp, Amanda Heard crazy thing that was on Saturday Night Live, the crazy trial up in Fairfax County. If you haven't followed that, I don't know. My mother used to read a lot of movie magazines. I think she got me addicted to it. It's an amazing case, but the libel laws are one of the guardrails for not only what's in news, but also in my book, and I can't discuss that publicly, but trust me, I'm glad Simon & Schuster has good lawyers.
when you asked that question, it reminded me of what was it, absence of malice. Where did you see that? Paul Newman's like, you don't print the truth, you just print what people say. Yeah, I mean, there's some truth to that. Yeah.
Thank you. So this will be our final question, and then we'll transition into audience question and answer. So I'm also going to make this somewhat general and in a way, what is your legacy? Talk about your body of work.
Michael's taking all the hard questions.
Oh, no, this is for both of you.
I'll take it.
You know, I really hope for me, being I've been fortunate to have a third career now writing books, and hopefully at some point doing some more based on the Organ Thieves. I hope my legacy is one of learning and of being flexible. And I've learned more about, for example, the African American presence and systemic racism in Richmond than I ever knew before, and I should have known a lot more earlier. So I think for me, it's a legacy of learning. But I always, I'm a big basketball fan. Michael knows that. I knew that Kansas was going to lose to North Carolina, and that was a fact. Since I'm a Kansas Jayhawk, I enjoyed seeing them finally get it done. But when I see these coaches being asked about their legacy, I'm sort of like, and so legacy to me is something for basically the obituary page, which I hope I'm not on too soon. One never knows. But I would just close with saying, change, open to other people's points of view and voices. And, also, there's an old saying about journalism about we should, afflict the comforted and comfort the afflicted. And I hope I've done more on the side of comforting the afflicted.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not trying to write my epitaph right now. I'll let other people decide what my legacy is. I mean, I went into newspapers all those years ago just because I like telling stories. So I'm a storyteller. Hopefully the story will reflect some level of accuracy about what happened at a given point in time in Richmond, which is where I've spent the bulk of my career. And, we'll let everybody else figure out what that means in the larger scheme of things.
And make no mistake about it, I know you both have long, illustrious careers ahead of you, so it's not that I was asking an epitaph. So now we will take questions from the audience. I'm assuming that's the microphone.
It was. That's the magic microphone that makes the other ones work.
Hi, thank you very much for this, and thank you for your good work in the newspaper all these years. I actually have a question for Stephanie. I was really struck by, like when you said you believe that newspapers made a mistake of going free in the 90s. But I'm wondering what your opinion is. What can newspapers or other journalism outlets, not just newspapers, good TV journalism, magazines, what could they be doing differently today or more recently to educate the electorate, to make us appreciate and consume and profit from good journalism?
Okay, well, thank you for that. I was not expecting to get hit with that question, or any question for that matter. I am a long-time journalism teacher. I have a degree in journalism. I considered going into journalism straight out of college and realized how difficult and cutthroat it was, and quickly became an English teacher who taught journalism students. And I don't want to
You're on a college campus, you're talking about cutthroat?
Well, no, I found that journalism, it was difficult to get anyone to take me as a young Black about that. I would walk into newsrooms and feel completely out of place. And it just wasn't the way I wanted to live my life. And so I decided to get a second degree and become an English teacher and teach journalism to students who I knew would go out and affect change. And they have. I think that, you know, my current experiences with media have been fraught. I don't know if many of you watch school board activity in the city of Richmond, but it has been a difficult journey for me. I'm a teacher. I came into this with a lot of idealism, right? I believe that people told the truth about things. And, you know, I believe that that's what journalists should do. My experience has been that there are times where I believe that stories get sensationalized, exaggerated, and sometimes they're completely fabricated, for lack of a better word. That has been my experience, just from living on this side of it. I purposely asked questions of our panelists to hear their perspectives on that, because I want to understand. I don't want to believe that people are fabricating stories or misrepresenting things on purpose, or because they need to sell papers, or because they need to get clicks or have people watch their television stations. I would hope that that's not the primary motivation. I think if I were to say what I'd like to see happen differently is that we see more stories that represent both sides of issues. For example, my experience on the school board, we're all highly qualified, caring people who love children. And so when one story is told from one perspective and the other perspective is not consulted, I feel that that's not necessarily what I think of as good journalism. So I hope that answers your question. That's right.
Thank you all for being here. I appreciate it. This is group Chip. I was going to push back on some of the things that you said. So earlier you were saying that advocating for writers referencing, you know, a lot of sources and sort of letting the consumer decide as, you know, for everything that you put in. And I think that that's true to a certain extent, but then you also get the idea of, well, isn't an abundance of media sources and the consumer choosing part of the reason that, you know, there's such a big following for these extreme viewpoints and sort of how those people are able to access those things. So I just kind of wanted to get your opinion on sort of where you put the line between, you know, the consumer taking a lot of, you know, information and choosing what to believe is a good thing versus a bad thing.
That's a good question. Can you answer that, Michael? No, in all seriousness, it's a great question, and I guess I probably didn't express it very well, but I was trying to say, to sort of underscore the importance of using multiple sources and using ones that, you know, how do we tell that young man who, you know, did the terrible shooting that he wasn't in a good place? In fact, is your question. Like, he was using multiple sources, but they were the ones that drove him into a mass murder. That's a great question. I think it goes to, you know, it does go to our educational system, and it goes to our many things, you know, family systems, faith systems, whatever. But how do you inculcate, you know, a sense of ethics and some framework for morality and making choices that aren't destructive? And I think that a lot of the things we've been seeing out of when the many sources on the dark web or the alt-right or whatever, it seems to draw in a lot of people who have some fairly serious mental health issues. I mean, that often comes out. They don't all, but a lot of them do. Charlottesville comes to mind. I don't know, how can we build on that answer?
I'm not sure. I mean, at some point, we've got to do better at teaching people what's credible information and what's essentially hate. And I mean, for some of us, it shouldn't be hard, but I mean, given the popularity of these sites, I mean, I think a lot of people, because journalists often are held in such low regard, they think that, well, anyone can do what we do. And anyone with the keyboard can do what we do. And anyone who has an opinion is a journalist. And, we're talking about ethical frameworks that need to be at the forefront when you're putting information out there. That's the responsibility. And we've got to be able to, I guess, educate people into a state of discernment as to what information is not only accurate, and yeah, there will always be mistakes because the people who put this information out are human. There will always be bad actors. But there's intent that differentiates some of these publications from others. Some of them clearly have an agenda that's dishonest. And I think there's a difference between the journalistic outlet that is trying and not always succeeding, and one that is intentionally trying.
The last word there was intentionally trying to misinform when Mike cut out. So we've got 1, 2, Susan, you'll get here. And I see one hand there. Before I get anyone else, if there's any young people here who wish to ask a question but feel intimidated by having to hold your hand up, just get my attention or Susan's attention and we'll make sure we get the mic to you.
Thank you. I just have one brief structural criticism, and that is that I don't disagree with anything any of you said at all. Anything that's open to be agreed with or disagreed with, I agree with you. What I would have preferred to have seen, something that I think would have possibly given me more enlightenment, because I haven't been enlightened because I've agreed with everything you said. It's like if I turn on MSNBC, I'm going to agree with everything they say. That's that addiction. And that's why it's kind of dumb of me to do that, but I do it on a nightly basis. But my point is, I would have loved to have seen one of your panelists here be representative of the right wing. And I don't know if there was an effort made to get someone like that on board. But I think that would have been an avenue to more enlightenment or drama. Certainly would have held my interest more. If I would have disagreed with everything that man or woman said, I assume. But if you'd had someone here who would have said what they're saying these days on Fox News about, no, we're not guilty in any way for what happened in Buffalo. We haven't pushed this great replacement theory. I would like to see you guys react to that instead of just telling me what I figured you'd be saying from the beginning.
Yeah, we're here to talk about democracy. I don't see that as a left or a right thing. And I think it's a problem in this country if somehow we have a segment or a political segment, be it left or right, that is not trying to uphold democracy. I think we get lost in the labels and to the point that they're meaningless. Conservatives. The conservatives nowadays are radical. They're talking about, they're pushing us in directions that aren't conservative. These terms have been rendered meaningless. We're talking about democracy. I assume everyone in this room supports democracy. Maybe not. Maybe we should have had someone here who who doesn't. Maybe that would be the yeah, and that's what we need to be interrogating. What is it like the hypothalamus thing? I mean, what is the appeal of not living in a democratic society?
Don't ask me. Don't ask me, but there's a lot of people who could ask, and they come back with some kind of an answer.
Yeah,
I think what he's just highlighting is
Yeah.
that the tunnel vision, the echo chamber is dangerous.
yeah,
And we got a lot of sight of that tonight.
yeah. I mean, I get that. I get emails. I try to have conversations outside the echo chamber that, I'll be honest, they don't go anywhere. If you're living in two separate realities, it's hard to have a productive discourse. I don't know. And you end up shouting each other.
I'd like to have a conversation with you one day, sir.
Okay. But you support democracy.
30 years in the United States Marine Corps.
Okay.
I defended democracy.
Okay.
And
Is there-
I'm gonna take this form right here, right now. Your first question today asked about an educated electorate. An educator, columnist, neither one of you mentioned what Thomas Jefferson said. What did Thomas Jefferson say? An educated citizenry is a vital requisite for the survival, our survival as a free nation. I thought for
We all
sure.
said that in some.
I thought for sure. And the thing is, when we talk today, we talk about the truth. It takes me to, you talk about movies, it takes me to A Few Good Men. Colonel Jessup asked a question. Can we
We're gonna go in order. We're gonna have her give her question, then there was one there, and then we can come back to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So I'm glad you spoke about Thomas Jefferson, but remember, in this country, for a very long time, we did not want free education because an educated citizenry would keep some folks out of power. And we did not even bring up anything about power here, because that's what's fighting against the democracy. I am a former journalism student, started off at Medill. I was a teacher, and now I was always really into the news, cut my teeth on the New York Times. I do not listen to the news anymore. I am very selective about what I read. I get the Richmond Times-Dispatch, I get the New York Times, but it has gone to the point where do I need that in my head? And we have to ask ourselves, what have we gotten to where a person who was a news hound, because of the awful news that we've had to deal with, and it started in the last presidential period, I couldn't listen to that anymore. And then the fighting back and forth. And I didn't feel as if the established journalists out there were really asking the right questions. And I think that's why many of us are at the point now where we don't even want to deal with it. We need to support local news. It's super important. I understand that. And maybe we need to get back to the point where folks get together and decide to put their money together to have their own local newspapers. Because I don't want to be reading about all this other stuff. I don't even look at the national news anymore. So how could we get beyond this, where what's being written about has nothing to do with who we really are?
That's an excellent question. I think our audience has reached a point where maybe I don't know, a newspaper used to be kind of a fulcrum, kind of a true reflection of the community, reflected the community, drove the conversation, or at least helped drive the conversation. With readership the way that it is, it's difficult to drive a conversation or even necessarily be a part of it in some ways.
I want to say something about that too. You know, this man here mentioned drama, right? I don't think the way, in the classic way that I was taught in journalism school, that news was supposed to be necessarily about drama. And that is what I'm finding, you know, just serving as a public official, right? What gets reported is the most salacious, most extreme, dramatic thing. And all the other important things that happen get ignored or fall by the wayside. And I think it is this kind of brain, you know, the stimulation, you know, that kind of, I call it in my classes mental masturbation. You know, that thing that we feel when there's drama or we're being stimulated in some way, we've gotten addicted to that. And that's what we're expecting in our news. And I think that has driven us far away from where we need to be in terms of just reading stories that are just stories of people, humans, people who love each other and may disagree. But this focus on acrimony and drama, I think, really has done a number on, you know, reporting and you know, good journalism.
We're gonna go over there for a question.
Thank you. So, job that you do, I'm a news junkie and have a great appreciation for how reporters cover the news. In that regard, it seemed like the news business, the legitimate news business, the people who try to tell the truth or tell the facts, had a real challenge in the first couple of years of the Trump candidacy and then his Trump presidency, because they weren't accustomed to actually saying something. They reported what they said until it basically was outright lies. And it took the Washington Post, New York Times, other papers some time to come to the conclusion that they could literally call what was being said was lies. And this gets to my question here about telling both sides. I'm going to shift gears here. We're in a climate crisis right now, and the science is pretty compelling, and yet many newspapers are still letting people speak as though it doesn't exist. We can have an honest debate about the way to approach it, but unfortunately, we still have people who are denying that it exists when the science is overwhelming. And I without getting into the merits of that, I appreciate how you wrestle with that kind of issue when the science may be settled, for example, or the facts may be pretty clear, but a certain constituency doesn't want to hear that, and you've got to deal with that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think I've witnessed an evolution in recent years by the industry, and not just at papers like the Times and the Post. I mean, I've seen it at my own newspaper, where there's more of a willingness to just call it. I think both sidism has been very destructive. I remember when Ken Cuccinelli was Attorney General and he was going after the professor at UVA, and it was nonsense. I mean, he got away with it. Yeah, Pat Michaels. It was just nonsense. Michael Mann. And yeah, it was just patently dishonest and just character assassination. And I don't think Cuccinelli was ever held into account for that. And yeah, I mean, we've got to find a way. I mean, I think we're in the midst of several existential crises. The climate, obviously, being the biggest one. I think the pandemic has been a crisis that we had some both sidism that got in the way of that. We're in an existential crisis about democracy that we've got to be honest about, because in a couple of years we may lose it if we're not careful. And I don't think people really even want to know. It's like one of those white supremacy. There are things this country just has been unwilling to ever deal with. That's existential in the way that it threatens democracy and everything else. And, you know, historically in the business, we've done that and we've moved away from that because it's essential. And yeah, some of the discourse, yeah, the drama, whatever you want to call it, it's probably triggering. I'm right there with you sometimes. I can't watch much more about what's coming out of Buffalo. But yeah. Go.
Oh, no.
We're talking here.
I just wanted to clarify, I did not say both sides. What I said was multiple perspectives, and I think there's a difference. Certainly, there is often a right and a wrong way to see something. But then there's nuance and perspective. So I don't want anyone to like misinterpret what I said. I didn't say both sides.
No, I mean, I wasn't even thinking about.
Well, it's okay.
No, there's some issues where both sides doesn't work, is all I'm saying. And we need it, we do our readers a disservice when we try to play it that way. So civil rights movement, how would you have covered that as a vote? Well, let's see. Lynching versus someone having the right to vote. Let's parse this out. No, it's kind of been a ridiculous way to go about journalism that we're finally kind of casting aside.
So we have time for Chip. You can weigh in for sure. And then we have one comment over here. And then I just want to encourage everyone to have conversations with each other in a smaller, easier to digest format. So go ahead, Chip.
Well, real quick, a little historical perspective on distrust of the media and respect your Marine Corps service. I grew up in a Marine Corps family. My father was Lieutenant General William K. Jones. My cousin Jim was a commandant. I remember when I was in high school in the late 60s, my father came back from Vietnam in 70 after taking the 3rd Marine Division out of Vietnam. And he was completely jaded, as I'm hearing you. It's unfortunate the lady has left who's jaded about it, but just to give you a little perspective, when you're in the spotlight, you're going to want to kill the messenger. Okay, I saw it with my Marine Corps dad. I wrote a book called Boys of 67 that profiles Jim Jones, who was a commandant then. I followed him to the San Francisco Examiner and figured out how he managed to turn the tide of the conversation. He kept talking. I'll stop talking. But those things are as old as the Old Testament.
Sir, thank you for your service. When you hear somebody break into the Capitol and try to overturn a presidential election and call himself a patriot, how does that make you feel?
I was disgusted.
Yes. The word has been debased. I don't understand what kind of world we live in where a word can be debased in that way.
Not to feel like I have to defend something, but I would ask you, anyone in this room, when we look back at the last election, the election's over, it's done, we move forward, just like the gubernatorial election is done, we move forward, the fall comes, the election's over, we move forward. Very interesting book about that election by Molly Hemingway called Rig. Very interesting, very, she doesn't say the election is stolen. Not at all. She says there's things that Trump done was completely wrong and all, but I think it goes back to what you said. There's many sides, there's two sides to a coin, there's many sides to an orange, and we need to be able to dialogue, and not because I'm a 65-year-old white-haired male standing at the Lee statue, want to dialogue with people a year ago, just to feel what they were about. That's what I went down to do. And I got yelled at as being a racist because I had a Marine Corps hat on by 2 young individuals. So we need, like you said, after this, we need to talk.
Yeah, I would like to talk because
that's how our country is going to go forward.
my father was a Marine. who served his country, came back from Vietnam, jaded and mentally ill, and was eventually shot and killed by police officers in his back for having a mentally, a break. And you mentioned Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson is credited with being the founder of public education, but he owned slaves and didn't believe that slaves should be educated. And so there are many sides of our stories, and we do need to talk.
Well, a friend who was here made a comment about power.
Yes.
Jimi Hendrix said, when we are more interested in the power of love than our love for power, that's what our country will be like, the world will be like. Amen.
All right, well, that's a nice note to end on. So if any of our panelists want to have a closing comment, I want to take a minute to thank Melvin Jenkins Jones, our award-winning law librarian here in the city of Richmond, who works at Richmond Public Library. Melvin is your go-to for all things legal and civic. And there's a lot of great programming coming back to the library. As you can see, we're working out on kinks. Thank you for bearing with us. And any final comments from you from the stage? Obviously, people are welcome to chat and talk, and we hope you do.
I would just say thank you. Thank you for being here. If we weren't dramatic enough, well, that actually wasn't in the invitation, but it's too bad this guy left. I thought there was some pretty nice, to me, it was fairly dramatic interchange. I completely agree with the idea of reconciliation, needing to talk, to have civil conversations, and how much has happened that's made that difficult. So, but basically, thank you for being here, and I'm going to turn it over to Mike.
Yeah, I echo all that. It's hard. Someone mentioned echo chamber. I mean, it's kind of hard in these events not to have that. I mean, you are the choir, and we're preaching to the choir. I mean, it's kind of just set up this way. If you didn't give a damn, you wouldn't be here. So, I mean, it's kind of the inherent flaw in this sort of thing. But I mean, that doesn't mean it's totally unproductive. That, I mean, I don't think we talk enough about these things, even people who are in relative agreement about it. Because we're talking about, some real problems, it's real stuff. And instead of sitting in front of the television, so that's got to be a good thing. So yeah, thank you all for showing up and being engaged, informed citizens.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night, everyone. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, on your way out, if you would please drop off your completed evaluation of the program, we would greatly appreciate your insight and evaluation. Thank you.
Thanks. No, it's not something down here, it's something else. And it's like, anytime that happens, it's like, I just have so much trouble focusing on it.